Please be advised this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
On the 29th of August 1943, Albert Pierrepoint would marry Anne Fletcher, a woman he had been courting for 5 years. She had worked at a shop just a couple of doors away from where Albert worked as a courier. During their courtship, she had seen Albert grieve the loss of his sister Ivy and his mother Mary, both of whom she had developed a close relationship with. Yet even after their wedding, Albert did not disclose that he worked as an executioner. During the war, Albert was called upon to carry out the executions of civilians, soldiers, and those who were deemed to be traitors. These executions would span beyond the end of the Second World War, with him carrying out the sentences of those found guilty of war crimes. One of the hangings he was summoned to carry out led him to travel to Gibraltar, where his plane would come under bombardment by anti-aircraft guns. Fortunately, they landed safely on the island, and Albert carried out the executions of 2 saboteurs. While travelling back home to Manchester, he decided to tell Anne about his secretive career. But when he disclosed this information, she didn't appear surprised, and admitted that she had guessed the purpose of his travels, piecing together local gossip and the fact that both Albert's uncle and father had both been executioners. Albert and Anne had been married for just under 2 years when the Second World War ended in May 1945. The war had lasted for 6 years and had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Britain was a country that had been battered and bruised, with the scars of the war visible in the bombed-out ruins that littered the cities. Feelings of pride and joy were mingled with grief. And though the war had ended, every day still proved to be a battle. Many had lost their homes and were living in temporary shelters, with rationing continuing until 1954. Meanwhile, unemployment levels soared, with workplaces either being damaged in the bombing raids or had been forced to close due to financial hardships. As soldiers returned to civilian life, they found it hard to find work. Some had lost their homes, and many struggled with both the physical and mental scars of war, resulting in roughly 60,000 divorces in 1947. By the summer of 1946, people began to feel a sense of normality returning, with theatres such as the Royal Opera House reopening, and the first post-war FA Cup final being staged at Wembley Stadium. On the 7th of June 1946, the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, began airing again, having been silent throughout the war, and the following day a victory parade was held in London to celebrate the end of the conflict. All these measures were signs of the optimism that was growing, and people embraced many of the freedoms they had once taken for granted in the pre-war years. Albert and Anne had also seen a change in their lives, with Albert deciding to take over the running of a public house called Help the Poor Struggler. For Albert, this new role meant that he was his own boss, and as he stated in his autobiography, it meant, quote, that I could take a 3 o'clock plane from Dublin after conducting an execution there, and be opening my bar without comment at 5:30. Not only did the bar offer Albert freedom to travel without having to explain his absence, but being a publican suited his friendly and charismatic nature, which garnered him loyal regulars, including members of law enforcement. While Albert was pulling pints in Lancashire, in London the city had once again come to life, with clubs, bars and theatres able to reopen, and people venturing out to enjoy the nightlife without the fears of air raids and the restrictions of the blackout. Amongst them was 29-year-old Neville Heath, whose crimes would resemble those of the Blackout Ripper, the main difference being the press coverage that Heath's crimes would generate. On the 6th of June 1917, William and Bessie Heath welcomed their first child, Neville, a golden-haired, blue-eyed boy who was given the nickname Angel Face due to his cherubic appearance. Over the next 2 years, the couple had another son, who would sadly pass away of tuberculosis when Neville was just 3 years old. This loss meant that the doting parents showered their surviving child with affection and were very lenient when it came to punishing bad behaviour. Neville's father, William, worked as a barber, and although his job wasn't well paid and his finances were stretched, particularly with the birth of their third child, Michael, he wished to provide his eldest son with the best education he could afford. And so, when Neville was 11 years old, he became a pupil at the Rutlish Grammar School, where he would be surrounded by children from affluent and upper-class families. While at school, Neville began to crave the lifestyles of his fellow students, and set his mind to achieving wealth and status. Even in his early teens, Neville demonstrated a charismatic personality, which overshadowed his less amiable traits, with one classmate recalling that Heath was, quote, an unmitigated liar, show-off, swankpot, and all the things that usually go to make an unpopular character. Yet somehow he was so charming that we all liked him. The youngster quickly learned that his endearing charm could prove to be beneficial, particularly when he needed to get out of trouble. The first sign of any deviant behaviour came to light when Neville was just 6 years old, and allegedly used his schoolmaster's cane to strike a female pupil. At the time, this was treated as an isolated incident. However, later in life it would be claimed that he had been known to be a bully and took delight in being cruel to animals. As he entered his teenage years, he began to commit petty offences, including acquiring some cakes from a shop by asking the shopkeeper to put the charge onto someone else's bill. At the age of 15, he would commit his first serious offence. He assaulted a female guest at a party. It was claimed that he had locked the girl in a room with him, attempted to kiss her, and placed his hands around her throat. Her screams alerted others to her plight. The red marks on the distressed girl's neck led to Neville being removed from the event. The following day he was confronted by the girl's father, who threatened to inform the school and the police of the assault. However, the young boy apologised for his actions and claimed the incident had been a parlour game that had gone too far, and his inexcusable behaviour was caused by him consuming too much alcohol. His explanation quelled the angry father, who decided not to proceed with his threat to report the matter. And from this experience, Neville began to understand how valuable his ability to charm people could be. Neville's personality was not matched by his academic ability, and at 17 he left school without any qualifications, forcing him to seek employment at a textile mill in London. Living on mediocre wages, Neville resorted to forgery to pay for the lifestyle he desired, using his ill-gotten gains for alcohol and sex workers. By 1935, the 18-year-old Neville Heath enlisted in the RAF, and by the following year he became an officer. Using his elocution lessons from school and adopting the mannerisms he had observed in his classmates, he was able to convince his fellow servicemen that he came from an upper-class background and had attended Eton and Oxford, two of the most prestigious institutions in the country. This pretence of a respectable gentleman from an affluent background was supported by Neville's ability to manipulate others and acquire money through deceptive means. In March 1937, Heath was told to report to the RAF base in Mildenhall. He arrived at the base on the 21st of March. However, the next day he failed to appear when his squadron was summoned for a roll call. This resulted in him being declared absent without leave. 3 months later he would be apprehended outside his family home in Wimbledon, where he had been residing since he had left the base. He was charged with desertion, theft of a motor vehicle, and writing a bad cheque. For these offences, he was brought before a court-martial. Neville pleaded guilty to the charge of desertion, admitting to escaping during his arrest on July 22, 1937. He also admitted to, quote, conduct to the prejudice of good order of Air Force discipline, in that he improperly and without permission removed and used for his own purpose a Morris motor car, the property of Sergeant G.W. Cousins of 80 Fighter Squadron, Debden. The third charge of writing a bad cheque was in relation to his mess bill, for which he had produced a cheque which was returned by the bank due to insufficient funds. This resulted in being confronted regarding the unpaid bill on March the 21st, the day prior to him being declared AWOL. 2 letters were presented to the court, the first one having been written by Heath on March the 21st in reference to his unpaid bill. It was addressed to Squadron Leader Turton Jones, and Heath wrote, "Dear Sir, please find enclosed my resignation, which will this time be accepted, I hope. I think this will be the easiest way out and save dragging the name of a decent squadron in the mud. I admit, sir, I have been an idiot and lost the chance of a decent career. I am going to Scotland now, and will go abroad in about a fortnight. 2 things I would like to say. One is that I must tell you how sorry I am that this has occurred, and the other is a favour. I should like to keep this matter away from my parents. My father is ill, and the shock will do him no good. I shall settle all the bills I've incurred within a month." The second letter also detailed his wish to resign, with him stating, quote, "I consider I have been a disgrace to the service, which will be well rid of me." Having sent these letters, Heath told the court that he returned to his parents' home in Wimbledon, where he resided until he was apprehended. While giving evidence, Heath explained that he had been waiting a response regarding his resignation, but he did not receive one. It was pointed out that Heath stayed at an address which was known to the Air Ministry, meaning that communications could have been sent there if needed, but there was no record that any attempts to contact Neville regarding him being AWOL had been made. The argument was presented by the defence that Neville Heath had made an impulsive decision and had not intentionally deserted his duty. Furthermore, he was a man of good character. He had no prior offences, and as such, he should be shown leniency and be allowed to continue his military service. Heath had pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 offences, and despite the defence expressing his desire to remain in the Air Force, he was ultimately dismissed due to behaviour unbecoming of an officer. Just a month after being dismissed from the RAF, Neville would appear in court again, charged with fraud. He had allegedly acquired funds via deception, and had used the money to pay sex workers to allow him to whip them. He also proposed marriage to a young woman, who subsequently loaned him £18, only for Heath to disappear. He was caught after he had used the name Lord Dudley in order to gain credit to purchase a motor vehicle. When confronted, he continued his claim, until he was advised that the man he was speaking to was a police officer, at which point Neville confessed. Once again, the defence would request leniency, suggesting that Neville Heath was, quote, "a silly young man who had got in over his head." The case resulted in him being placed on probation for 2 years, and his mother gave an interview to the Daily Mirror regarding her son's behaviour, during which she stated, "I am afraid Neville has been spoiled. By his last escapade he has ruined his father's business. He is not a criminal. He is really a clean-living, decent young fellow. This will be a severe lesson to him. And now we will have to find a job. His father and I are waiting for him to come back so that we can do our utmost to help him." It was evident that Neville did not learn his lesson, as in July the following year he appeared in court again, this time charged with breaking and entering, and forging a banker's draft. The prosecutor, Mr. Burge, made a point of highlighting that Neville had been assisted in his criminal endeavours by his appearance as a well-spoken and well-dressed young man. Neville pleaded guilty to the charges, and the judge was made aware of the other offences committed by the defendant, for which he had been placed on probation. This was taken into consideration when determining his sentence of 3 years in Borstal. Heath proved to be a model inmate and was rewarded for his good behaviour by being given leadership roles within the institution. He would only serve a year due to the outbreak of the Second World War, and due to his exemplary behaviour, the governor of the Borstal assisted Heath in submitting an application to the Air Force. But despite this glowing recommendation regarding his good character, Heath's past indiscretions would come back to haunt him, with the Air Force rejecting his application due to his criminal record. He was able to enlist in the Royal Army Service Corps, whose role was to supply food and weapons to the British Army. Within weeks of him signing up, he was deployed to Cairo, where he would serve as a private. While there, he quickly discovered the brothels and found that they offered him the opportunity to explore his sexually sadistic nature. His need to fulfill his sexual desires led to him requesting medical leave on a number of occasions. This caused his superiors to investigate his medical claims, and in doing so they discovered the real reason for his absence. This, combined with the discovery that he had been receiving 2 wages, due to him having 2 pay books, resulted in him being ordered to return to Britain to face a court-martial. Neville was to be transported back to the UK via ship. However, when the vessel made a brief stop in Durban, South Africa, he seized the opportunity to escape. Disappearing into the busy port, he managed to avoid being apprehended. Over the preceding weeks, he began to shape a new identity, taking on the guise of someone who was a South African-born aristocrat who had lived and was educated in England. Under his new alias as James Armstrong, he was able to join the South African Air Force in 1941. His service was exemplary, and he quickly attained the rank of captain. During this time, he became acquainted with Elizabeth Pitt Rivers, who came from a wealthy and influential family. Within a year of their meeting, the pair were married, although her family did not completely support the union. For Neville, the relationship offered him a chance to improve his social standing, introducing him to the lifestyle he had dreamed of as a youth, and his good looks and ability to charm others meant that few questioned his true intentions. He was able to maintain the pretense and carried out his Air Force duties with distinction. Just over a year into his service, Neville's criminal history came to light. However, it was decided to overlook his past due to his current good conduct. In 1944, Neville requested a transfer to the Royal Air Force using his new alias. His application was successful and he returned to England in order to take on his new duties, leaving his wife Elizabeth and their young son Robert in South Africa. While serving, Heath was part of a bomber squadron who aided in the liberation of Belgium. He also carried out an act of heroism when in October 1944, the plane he was piloting came under fire from anti-aircraft guns. The plane was passing over the Dutch and German border when it was hit. The aircraft caught fire and began plummeting to the ground. As he ordered the occupants to bail out, he realised that the navigator was trapped, and instead of leaving him to perish, he risked his life to save the navigator, with them both parachuting to safety before the plane crashed. This act of bravery had a detrimental impact on Neville's health. He began to experience blackouts, sudden changes in mood, and became increasingly dependent on alcohol, with a senior officer observing that when Heath was drunk, he became arrogant and irresponsible. Not only was he drinking more, but he had taken up gambling, accruing large debts which he attempted to pay off by writing bad cheques. When he returned to South Africa to be with his wife, his behaviour became increasingly concerning, with Heath recalling an occasion where, quote, "I felt my head go tight. Then it was half an hour later. I was given to understand that I had tried to shoot my wife and myself, but had collapsed. It was a blackout." By December 1945, he was facing another court-martial for fraud, theft, wearing medals he had not earned, and a behaviour unbecoming of an officer. While in his private life, Elizabeth had filed for divorce, citing adultery and desertion. With his life in South Africa in ruins and having been dismissed from the Air Force, Neville returned to England in February 1946. But he did not allow these setbacks to change him. Instead, the 29-year-old, once again, used his good looks and charm to reinvent himself, this time going by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Heath. And as before, he found he was able to gain people's trust and continued his womanizing ways. One thing Neville wanted to regain was his chance to fly planes again, and he applied for a civilian pilot's license, but in June of 1946 his application was rejected due to his dismissal from the Air Force. Now 29 years old, his career prospects and financial situation was bleak, forcing Neville to move back in with his parents in London, but it did not prevent him from continuing his pretense of a wealthy and successful man. On the 15th of June 1946, he attended a dance under the alias of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Heath. While there, he caught the eye of 19-year-old Yvonne Simmons, a naive young woman who became enthralled by him. Having met initially at the dance, the pair then headed to the exclusive Panama Club in Kensington, where Heath was a frequent guest. From there they continued drinking at the Overseas Club, where the 19-year-old had been staying while in the capital. As Yvonne would later state, Heath acted as the perfect gentleman. As such, when they parted that night, she was more than happy to see him again. The pair reunited the next morning, and having spent the day together, Neville proposed marriage that evening, to which Yvonne accepted. She agreed to join her new fiancé at the elegant family-run Pembridge Court Hotel, where the couple who were booked in as husband and wife spent the night in room 4. The following morning, Yvonne bid farewell to Neville as she boarded the train, excited to return to her family home in Worthing with the news of her engagement, while her fiancé remained in London. Heath continued to stay at the hotel while he negotiated the details of flying a staff member from the Daily Mail newspaper to Copenhagen that Saturday. Part of this involved him meeting with journalist Harry Proctor, who, unbeknownst to Heath, had been asked by his colleague to vet the pilot to ensure the agreement was legitimate. Meeting in a pub, Heath and Proctor enjoyed a pint and engaged in a casual conversation, with the journalist's recollection of this interaction being, quote, "I liked Neville Heath from the very first beer we had together. He was without doubt one of the most handsome men I have ever seen, and he had great personal charm." Harry Proctor could not have imagined that within a matter of days this likeable gentleman would become the focus of one of the biggest news stories of the year. On Thursday the 20th of June, Heath had a date planned for that evening, but prior to this he spent time having a few pints with a former school friend, and the pair ended their reunion at the Trevor Arms pub, where Heath had arranged to meet his date, Marjorie Gardiner. The 5'4" brunette stood alone at the bar, dressed in what at the time would have been considered to be a provocative outfit, but for her it was an expression of her immersion into the bohemian lifestyle she had embraced since she had studied at art college. Marjorie possessed an artistic spirit and had created numerous art pieces, had been an extra in a couple of films, and was in the process of writing a novel. She was described as someone who embraced life with a live-for-the-moment attitude, with one friend adding that Marjorie had one of the sweetest natures I have ever known. Originally from the Yorkshire city of Sheffield, Marjorie had experienced London life while studying art in Chelsea, where she was noted to be very gifted. By 1940 she was living in the seaside town of Blackpool with her Royal Air Force husband, Peter, with whom she had a daughter. However, by 1946 the pair had separated, and their 2-year-old daughter was living with Marjorie's 70-year-old mother in Sheffield. It is uncertain what led to Marjorie returning to London. Perhaps she hoped to pursue work, but since her arrival in the capital, the 32-year-old flitted from one boarding house to the next, while surviving on a minimal income. She was known to have pursued a number of relationships, and it was alleged that Marjorie and Heath had had a sexual relationship in April of 1946, during which they engaged in sadomasochistic activities. After greeting Heath and his friend, the trio had a drink together before the former school friend departed, leaving Heath and Marjorie to continue their date by heading to the Normandy Hotel for dinner. Once they finished their meal, they made their way to the Panama Club, the same place he had enjoyed drinks with Yvonne just a few days before. Neville and Marjorie would spend the evening dancing and drinking, before being witnessed leaving the club together. A taxi driver took the drunken couple back to the Pembridge Court Hotel, where Heath led Marjorie to room 4, the same room where he had spent the night with his new fiancée. He stayed with Marjorie until Friday morning, when he left her and headed to the train station to travel to Worthing, where Yvonne was waiting for him. He spent that Friday with Yvonne, becoming acquainted with her parents and taking his fiancée out for lunch. Meanwhile, at around 2 p.m, Alice Wyatt, the manager of the Pembridge Court Hotel, noted that she hadn't seen Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Heath, who had become a familiar face at the hotel in the last few days. Yet no one had seen him return to the hotel the previous night. Alice instructed the chambermaid to go to room 4 to see if the guest required anything. Obediently, the maid headed up the stairs and knocked on the door a couple of times before letting herself in. The room was quiet, the curtains still closed, yet rays of sunlight penetrated through the gaps, bringing a dim glow into the space. She noted that the bedding on both single beds had been disturbed, and one of the beds was still occupied by a woman with dark brown hair, who was lying with her face enveloped by a pillow. Concerned for the occupant, the chambermaid approached the bed and realised that the brunette woman before her was not sleeping. Her skin was ashen and cold to the touch. Her back was bare and appeared to have deep gashes upon the flesh, and upon closer inspection, the woman's hair was stained with blood. Realising the woman was deceased, the chambermaid went in haste to contact the police. Upon their arrival, the curtains were opened, flooding the room with glorious summer sunlight, which revealed the sickening scene. There was extensive bloodstains on the bedding and the floor. The victim was resting on her front, her body devoid of clothing. She had been bound to the bed with a handkerchief attached to her ankles. Her body was riddled with wounds, her face severely bruised, her breast disfigured, and long deep gashes riddled her back. In an act reminiscent of the crimes of Gordon Cummins, the killer had also inserted an object into Marjorie's genitalia. The deceased woman was quickly named by the discovery of an identity card in the room, and upon the scene being photographed and a cursory assessment being carried out by the pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson, the body was removed from the hotel. It was evident that the news of the discovery had spread swiftly, as a crowd had gathered in the street. Amongst them were a number of journalists, and the rumour soon spread that the death had been the result of a backstreet abortion, a practice that was prevalent due to abortions being illegal at the time. However, the journalist Harry Proctor alleged that when he spoke to a police officer regarding the speculation, the officer told him that he had never seen an abortion like it. The true nature of Marjorie's death would be revealed during the post-mortem, which was carried out by Dr. Keith Simpson. Having assessed the body at the scene, he had already made the determination that Marjorie had died in the early hours of the morning. He theorised that the victim appeared to have been whipped in what he considered had started as a consensual act. However, for some reason, this had escalated, with the victim being beaten and her body savagely mutilated. He noted there were teeth marks on the breast, the perpetrator biting so deeply that he had almost severed the nipples. Dr. Simpson counted a total of 17 deep slashes located on the victim's head, back, shoulders, buttocks, chest and abdomen, which he believed had been caused by a whip. It was evident that at some point Marjorie had been gagged, and her wrist and ankles were bound. For some reason, the killer had only left a handkerchief on the ankles, but bruising on the wrists and face identified where the bindings had been. The pathologist also examined the victim's genitalia, registering a 7-inch internal wound. Concluding his assessment, Dr. Simpson determined that all the injuries had been inflicted prior to death, and that Marjorie had died due to suffocation, most likely caused by her head being forced into the pillow on which her face had been resting when she was discovered. These details were kept from the press, but the brutal nature of the crime meant that the police wanted to apprehend the murderer as soon as possible. And fortunately, the killer had given them a key detail. He had checked into the hotel using his real name. This allowed them to issue an appeal with regards to the individual they wished to speak to, in connection with the murder. The appeal stated, quote, "The man is described as Neville George Cleveley Heath, aged 29. He is 5'11" and a half inches tall, of medium build, fresh complexion, fair hair, blue eyes. He may be wearing a double-breasted, blue-grey suit with a thin stripe or a check sports jacket and flannel trousers." Unaware that her fiancé was being hunted by the police, Yvonne spent Saturday evening with Heath, with the pair going for a meal at the Blue Peter Club in Angmering. While they ate, Neville advised Yvonne that a murder had occurred in the room they had shared at the Pembridge Court Hotel. Wishing to know what had happened, Yvonne asked what Heath knew. Her fiancé admitted he had lent his room key to a man who wished to have some privacy with a woman he was paying for sex. He was made aware of the murder by Inspector Barrett from Scotland Yard, who took Heath to view the body. He voiced his disgust at what he saw, describing it as a gruesome sight, claiming it must have been carried out by a sexual maniac. Heath provided Yvonne with graphic details, including his claim that the woman had died because a poker had been inserted into her genitals, but Inspector Barrett had corrected him by saying he believed she had been suffocated. As he had done so many times before, he was able to present a trustworthy facade that convinced Yvonne that he was not responsible for the murder. She left him that evening believing he was innocent, yet the following day she would read in the newspapers that the police wanted to locate Heath in relation to the crime. Not only was she alarmed by this development, but her parents also expressed their concern, causing Yvonne to call Heath to discuss the issue. He told her he understood their worries, but reassured her that he was going to head to London to clear up the matter, and that she would hear from him that evening, but he would do neither. Prior to leaving Worthing, Heath penned a letter to Inspector Barrett at Scotland Yard, in which he tried to explain his connection to Marjorie Gardiner, stating, quote, "I feel it my duty to inform you of certain facts in connection with the death of Mrs. Gardiner at Notting Hill Gate. I booked in at the hotel last Sunday, but not with Miss Gardiner, whom I met for the first time during the week. I had drinks with her on Friday evening, and was still with her when she met an acquaintance with whom she was obliged to sleep. The reasons, as I understand them, were mainly financial. It was then that Mrs. Gardiner asked if she could use my hotel room till 3 o'clock, and said that if I returned after that, I might spend the remainder of the night with her. I gave her my key and told her to leave the door open. It must have been almost 3 a.m. when I returned to the hotel room and found her in the condition of which you are aware. I realised I was in an invidious position, and rather than notify the police, I packed up my belongings and left. Since then I have been in several minds whether to come forward or not, but in view of the circumstances I have been afraid. I can give you a description of the man. He was aged approximately 30, dark hair, with a small moustache about 5'9" high, and of slim build, and his name was Jack. I gather he was a friend of Mrs. Gardiner's of some long standing. At the moment I have assumed another name. I would like to come forward and help, but I cannot face the music of the fraud charge, which will obviously be preferred against me. I have the instrument with which Mrs. Gardiner was beaten, and am forwarding this to you today. You will find my fingerprints on it, but you should also find others as well." End quote. He posted this letter, but never sent the article he referred to. By that evening he had left Worthing, and Yvonne would not hear from him again. Hoping to find more clues to help track down their suspect, police began to retrace Marjorie's movements on the night she was murdered, and in doing so they acquired more information about Heath. Alice Wyatt was able to confirm that Heath had been a guest at the hotel for a week, recalling that he had checked in with a young woman he alleged was his wife. Regarding the night of the murder, Alice advised that no one had reported any disturbances, except for a door slamming at around 1:30, which occurred on the floor where room 4 was located. Police then tracked down the taxi driver who had dropped Heath and Marjorie at the hotel at midnight, who was able to advise that he had collected the pair from the Panama Club, recalling that both were clearly under the influence of drink. Staff and regulars at the Panama Club all confirmed seeing the couple, including Iris Humphreys, a friend of Marjorie's, who stated she was there with a man who matched Heath's description, while staff were able to identify the man as Neville Heath. This information, and knowing that their person of interest had a taste in staying in high-end hotels, officers were sent out to make inquiries at establishments across the capital, with the search being extended to boarding houses. Unravelling the suspect's past, Heath's criminal history was unearthed, revealing him to be a con artist, fraudster and thief. Some people claimed he had a tendency to propose to a young woman, either to convince them to sleep with him or obtain funds from them. Investigators also discovered that Heath had arranged to fly to Copenhagen, which raised fears that he had managed to flee the country. As Heath was a member of the Luton Flying Club, police sought information as to whether they had any records of him acquiring a plane. They were advised, quote, "A man giving the name of Neville Heath rang up Marshall's Airport in Cambridge last week and asked if he could charter a plane. None were available. suggesting that he had not been able to leave the country. Further investigations would lead detectives to the hotel that Heath had stayed at while in Worthing. This put them on his trail, but they were still a step behind. By Tuesday the 25th of June, they had established that while Heath was in Worthing, he had been seen with a young lady, who would later be identified as Yvonne. Mr. Girdwood, the owner of the hotel in Worthing, confirmed that Heath had stayed over the weekend. He claimed that the guest was witnessed carrying a brown bag with him, and it seemed that he had limited amounts of money. One thing that did prove useful was that Heath had disappeared from the hotel on Sunday, and had left his RAF uniform behind. By Wednesday the 26th of June, Scotland Yard received a tip that Heath had returned to London, and they refocused their search efforts to the capital once more. It was revealed by the Daily Herald on the 28th of June that Heath had almost been caught by police when he was witnessed in a public house next to Bishopgate police station in the company of a slightly built, blonde woman. Unfortunately, by the time officers arrived, the pair had disappeared. This led to the suspicion that Heath was being harboured by an acquaintance, and searches of houses connected to people associated with him were carried out, with some being kept under surveillance in the hopes their suspect would appear. While search efforts intensified in London, over 100 miles away in Bournemouth, 21-year-old Doreen Marshall was staying in the seaside town while recuperating from measles and influenza. Doreen was born in Brentford, London, to Grace and Charlie Marshall on the 25th of August 1924, with her being the couple's youngest daughter. By 1939, the family had moved to Pinner in Middlesex, and during the Second World War she was conscripted to serve in the Women's Royal Naval Service, otherwise known as the Wrens, primary aim for them to take on non-combatant duties, allowing male officers to serve on the front lines. These duties didn't just include driving, clerical work and cooking. There were many who carried out vital roles such as working at Bletchley Park as code breakers and operating radar equipment. Having recently been demobilised from service, it was on the advice of her doctor and her father that she had headed to the coast, with the hopes the sea air would aid in her recovery. Standing at 5'9" tall, with dark brown wavy hair and an attractive face, she caught the eye of a number of people in the town, and the staff at the hotel where she was staying found her to be a warm and friendly character. While seated on a bench on the promenade, Doreen attracted the attention of Group Captain Rupert Brooks, whom, after they had engaged in a prolonged conversation, invited her to join him for afternoon tea. Having enjoyed the company of the tall and charismatic man, Doreen agreed to meet him later that evening for dinner. Being a good-looking couple, the pair garnered glances from other guests as they sat in the restaurant at the Tollard Royal Hotel. The pair retired to the writing room, where they shared a few drinks, before Doreen requested that a taxi was called to take her back to her hotel. Rupert offered to walk her there instead, adding that it would be nice to stroll on such a warm summer's night. By Saturday, the 6th of July, the manager at the Norfolk Hotel had grown concerned for Doreen, having not seen his guest since Wednesday, and noting that her room and belongings appeared to have been untouched. He proceeded to contact other hoteliers in the area to see if they had seen Doreen. During one of these calls, he spoke to Mr. Ralph, the manager of the Tollard Royal Hotel, who was able to confirm that a woman, matching Doreen's description, had been witnessed leaving his hotel on Wednesday evening, in the company of one of his guests, Group Captain Rupert Brooks. Further inquiries led to the conclusion that no one had seen Doreen since, causing the Norfolk Hotel manager to contact the police. Knowing that the authorities had been informed about Doreen's disappearance, Mr. Ralph spoke to Group Captain Rupert Brooks, advising him to speak to the police, as he may have information that could assist in the search for Doreen. Seemingly eager to aid the police, Rupert arrived at Bournemouth Police Station at 5:30 that Saturday, where he spoke to Detective Constable Souter. During the informal interview, Rupert was shown an image of Doreen, and he confirmed that he had been with her on Wednesday night, going on to state that the 21-year-old had told him she was planning to go away with her American boyfriend the following day, and so she wouldn't be able to meet him again. Finding the man to be forthcoming and helpful, DC Suter thanked Rupert for his assistance and told him he was free to go. Meanwhile, the attractive young woman's disappearance in the popular seaside town was quickly picked up by the press, who ran articles requesting information, with one newspaper running the story underneath a piece regarding the murder of Marjorie Gardner in London. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, these two cases were linked, which DC Suter would come to realise as Group Captain Rupert Brooks made his way out of the police station. As he walked through the lobby, Rupert encountered a man and a woman. DC Suter noted that upon seeing the woman, the colour seemed to drain from Rupert's face. He seemed frozen for a moment, as the pair approached the desk to state that they were Doreen's father and sister, who had travelled from London upon being informed that their relative was missing. Hearing this, Rupert stepped in to speak to the pair, and while the desk clerk dealt with their inquiry, he told them that he had seen Doreen, and although DC Suter couldn't hear most of the conversation, he noticed that the group captain was fidgeting with a scarf he had tightly wrapped around his neck, and as the material revealed the skin underneath, the officer saw distinctive scratch marks. Recalling a report that had been issued regarding the man wanted for the Marjorie Gardner murder, DC Suter swiftly located the piece and read the description. Aged 29, he is 5'11.5" tall, of medium build, fresh complexion, fair hair, and blue eyes. In that moment it dawned on the officer that he was staring at the wanted man. Once Doreen's family had been escorted away, DC Suter stepped in and asked if Rupert was in fact Neville Heath. With his usual confidence, the man responded, no. But Suter's suspicions were now heightened, and he asked Rupert to carry on with his statement regarding his meal with Doreen, as the smallest detail may help with the case. Rupert obliged, and while he was sat in the interview room, calls were made to Scotland Yard. While waiting for the arrival of the Metropolitan Police, D.I. George Gates took over the investigation. Rupert was searched, and in his pockets they found £4 and 10 shillings. When advised that he was being detained for questioning, Rupert requested that his coat be retrieved from his hotel room, in case he became cold during the night. D.I. Gates acquired it for him, and prior to handing the court over it was searched, revealing a return ticket to London, a single pearl, and a left luggage ticket from Bournemouth train station. With the suspect held in detention, an officer was sent to the railway station, where they retrieved a brown leather suitcase, inside which investigators found a leather riding whip. It was worn at the end, with its support wires exposed, and upon these was found dried blood, although it appeared someone had attempted to clean it. Alongside this was a navy blue woolen scarf, which was stained with blood. Within its fibres were found hairs that would be determined to match Marjorie Gardner's. Other articles of clothing in the case were labelled with the name Heath, making officers certain that the man they were holding was in fact Neville Heath. Room 81 of the Tallard Royal Hotel was searched, uncovering further evidence, including a knotted blood-stained handkerchief which had been secreted in a dressing-table drawer. Hairs tangled in the knot were consistent with those of the missing Doreen Marshall. It would not be until 11:30 that Saturday evening that the suspect would begin to write his statement, which took him just over 3 hours to complete. In his statement he wrote that during the evening, Doreen told him that she was thinking about changing her plans, advising she was considering returning home a couple of days earlier than planned. He alleged that Doreen also mentioned 2 American men whom she had been dating, one of whom had proposed marriage, and Neville continued to claim that, quote, at 11 p.m. Miss Marshall suggested going away, but I persuaded her to stay a little bit longer. At 11:30 p.m. the weather was clear and we left the hotel and sat on a seat near the hotel, overlooking the sea. He claimed that he had asked her if they could meet again, but she told him she was busy, and that she would contact him on Sunday the 7th of July. He concluded by recalling the last time he saw Doreen, claiming, quote, I left her at the pier and watched her cross the road and enter the gardens, adding he believed he briefly saw her the following day entering a shop, but it was only a glimpse, so he couldn't be certain. The news of Heath's detention in Bournemouth made the headlines on Sunday the 7th of July, with the press reporting that he was being held for questioning regarding Marjorie Gardiner's murder. Yet behind the scenes, the investigators had swiftly linked the cases of Marjorie and Doreen, with D.I. Spooner from Scotland Yard arriving to head the investigation. Having collated the available evidence, D.I. Spooner would sit down to formally interview Neville Heath at 5:20 on the Monday morning. And confronted with the evidence, the suspect willingly admitted his true identity. He also confessed that he knew Marjorie and had seen her on the night of her murder, claiming that he had given the key for his hotel room directly to Marjorie, as she wanted to take a man somewhere private in order to earn some money. This did not match what was known about Marjorie, as she had never operated as a sex worker. Heath alleged that he agreed to let Marjorie use the room on condition that once her client had left, she would spend the rest of the night with him. When confronted about the whip, Heath told D.I. Spooner that it was the item he was going to send to Superintendent Barrett. He proceeded to tell the officer that he had barely had any sleep and wished to rest before he made a formal statement. 2 parallel news stories ran in the papers, with headlines proclaiming that Heath had been apprehended and he was expected to arrive in London on Monday morning, while separate stories continued to appeal for help in finding the missing Doreen Marshall, who was described as a, quote, extremely good-looking girl. She was wearing a black dinner gown and a lemon-coloured swagger coat. The article piqued the interest of Bournemouth resident Mrs. Evans, who had been walking her black spaniel earlier that morning. As part of their regular routine, she had made her way to Branksome Chine, a small river valley located to the west of the town. The Chine has a winding woodland path which led down to the beach, and as Mrs. Evans and her dog headed along the route, her attention was drawn to a rhododendron bush, where a large number of flies had gathered. With it being a hot summer morning, Mrs. Evans didn't think much of it at the time. But now reading the news story made her recall the swarm, and accompanied by her father, she made her way back to the area. Sunlight still filtered through the glade of trees, with the cooling shadows offering shelter from the heat of the evening. Arriving at the rhododendron bushes, the father and daughter noticed that the flies still blighted the spot. Instructing his daughter to stay on the path, Mr. Evans decided to take a closer look, and there in the undergrowth he could make out a figure concealed beneath a yellow coat. The police arrived at the scene by 8:30, but with the fading light it was decided the area would be cordoned off and a thorough examination of the site would commence the following morning. As beachgoers headed to the seashore that Tuesday morning, they were intrigued by the police activity within the picturesque Chine, with officers standing guard preventing curious people from getting too close. Along the path, beneath some loose branches, was a mound of fabric, a yellow coat, a black dinner dress, and some ladies' undergarments. These concealed the body of a woman, devoid of clothing except for a shoe on her left foot. As the body was carefully removed from the scene, forensic teams began a fingertip search of the Chine, allowing them to build up an idea of what happened. Up to 20 feet away from where the body had lain, officers found bloodstains. They also located a blue powder compact and individual pearls which formed a necklace. These discoveries led to the theory that the attack had occurred in a different location, and the body had been moved to the undergrowth, where the offender had attempted to conceal it. While searches of the Chine continued, a post-mortem was carried out. The pathologist noted that the victim had fought back against her attacker, cuts on her fingers believed to have been caused by the slashing motion of a blade. The young woman's arms showed that the killer had attempted to restrain her by gripping her wrist so tightly that he had left fingernail marks. Bruising on her wrist was also consistent with the fact that at some point the killer had bound them with some form of fabric. Red marks on the left collarbone and several broken ribs, one of which had punctured the left lung, led the pathologist to suggest that the killer had knelt upon the chest during the attack. perhaps whilst he was trying to restrain his victim. Above the marks on the collarbone, the pathologist logged 2 cuts to the neck. He also registered that the victim had been mutilated, with a Y-shaped cut from the vagina extending up to each breast, from which one of the nipples had been bitten off. In addition to this, the victim had suffered extensive injuries to her vaginal and anal canals. The idea that the body had possibly been dragged to the disposal site was reinforced by tears on the woman's back. Upon completion of the examination, pathologists concluded that the death had been caused by the 2 deep horizontal cuts across the throat, while the mutilation of the body had occurred after death. The pathologist also voiced his belief that the savage nature of the attack would have caused the killer to be coated in blood. The evidence was swiftly linked to Neville Heath, starting with the pearl that had been found in his coat pocket, which was the missing piece of Doreen's necklace, believed to have been snapped during the attack. It was determined that some of Doreen's jewellery was missing, and after an appeal had been launched to locate them, a pawnbroker came forward to state that he had purchased a watch and a ring for £4.10, the exact amount Heath had had in his pocket when he was searched at the police station. Investigators also conducted interviews with people in Bournemouth in order to establish what had occurred around the time of the murder. The manager at the Tollard Royal Hotel stated that Heath, under the identity of Group Captain Rupert Brooks, had checked into the hotel, where he remained for 13 days, although 4 days into his stay the guest had requested a move to a room with a gas fire. Heath later claimed this was because he had planned to use the gas fire to take his own life. Mr. Relf recalled that Heath was a charismatic young man who would happily stop and chat to fellow guests, although as his stay went on, the hotelier had noticed some puzzling details. He began to note that the seemingly wealthy man didn't have any cash on him. Instead, he charged everything to his room bill, and despite wishing to appear affluent, Heath hadn't changed his clothing during his 13-day stay. Heath had developed a relationship with the hotel's night porter, who recalled on the night he witnessed Doreen and Heath, the young lady seemed ill and was quite distressed. He also stated that he saw the pair leave the hotel but never saw Heath return. Another guest reiterated the claim that Doreen seemed uncomfortable in Heath's presence, to the extent that the young lady had pulled them to one side and asked them to get her a taxi. But this did not happen, as Heath interrupted by stating he would walk Doreen to her hotel. The hotel staff and guests also told officers that Heath was witnessed on the Friday morning wearing the same clothes he had always worn, except for the addition of a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. No one recalled seeing any signs of blood on the man's clothing. The last detail made investigators theorise that Heath had been naked when he had committed the murder, and had likely washed himself in the sea before getting dressed and returning to the hotel. They did, however, wonder how Heath had entered the hotel without being seen, a detail that would be explained by both the night porter and Heath during questioning, with the former stating that he hadn't seen Heath return to the hotel, but he went to room 81 in the morning and was surprised to find the guest asleep in his bed. The only thing out of place was a pair of boots that were coated with sand, which reinforced the idea that Heath had been on the beach after the murder. Heath explained to officers that he had been playing a prank on the night porter by returning to his room via a ladder at the rear of the hotel, which had been there while building works were being carried out. The confident man had told other hotel staff about his prank. However, police believed it was just a front to disguise the actual time Heath had returned to the hotel. Having been transported to London to answer questions regarding Marjorie Gardiner's death, Neville Heath was included in an identity parade, where he was selected by the receptionist of the Panama Club and the taxi driver who had taken Heath and Marjorie to the Pembridge Court Hotel. While the investigation was proceeding in London, Bournemouth police were still dealing with a mystery. They had found a clump of dark brown hair some 40 yards away from where Doreen's body had been discovered, and with reports that the 21-year-old had an acquaintance called Peggy, they had to consider the fact that there could possibly be another victim. Appeals in the newspapers for Peggy to come forward went unanswered. It would not be until the 16th of July that the Director of Public Prosecutions issued a report stating, "I am now satisfied that there is not another missing body, at least in this locality. We have checked up on all the people reported missing who were likely to be in this area." Peggy was never identified, and when a Freedom of Information request was rejected in November 2010, the assessor stated, "This exemption applies to information in the extract that relates to an unconnected murder that remains unsolved, and this information may be used to investigate the case in the future." This leaves us to wonder whether Neville Heath had claimed other victims. Unable to determine if there was another victim due to a lack of evidence and no body, the focus fell back on the two murders, and during Heath's committal hearing for Marjorie Gardiner's death, the prosecution voiced they wished to pursue him separately for the murder of Doreen Marshall. Heath spent most of his committal hearing making notes, barely looking up to register those who had been called to speak. He only looked up briefly when the magistrate agreed to allow the two cases to be tried separately, with a date set for the 24th of September 1946. While he awaited trial, Neville Heath was held at Brixton Prison in South London, where he was placed under psychological assessment. Heath had claimed that he was innocent, and despite his defence suggesting that he considered an insanity plea, he declined. But given the nature of his crimes, it was imperative to understand his mental state. Meanwhile, the newspapers reported that he was being treated favourably, receiving deliveries of mystery magazines and books. He was also allowed to wear his own clothes and choose his meals. As highlighted by Neil Root in his book Frenzy, this case exemplified the view that murder sells. With tabloids printing stories about the killer, the growing public attention was fuelled by daily reports of the charismatic and handsome man who was awaiting trial for murder. We have become accustomed to high-profile cases attracting large public attention. Yet Heath's was one of the first to attract a different type of interest, with admirers of the killer gathering outside the court hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had been romanticised by the tabloids. He was also one of the first to profit from his crimes, by selling the exclusive rights to his story to the Sunday Pictorial newspaper. And although he was happy to welcome journalists, he banned his parents from seeing him. 13 hours before the trial commenced on Tuesday the 24th of September 1946, a queue began to form outside the Old Bailey, with hundreds of people hoping to get a seat in the courtroom, or at least catch a glimpse of those involved in the trial. With only 23 public seats available, many were left disappointed. Waiting among the crowds were journalists from around the world eager to capture the salacious details. In courtroom number 1 sat a jury of 10 men and 2 women, with the proceedings overseen by Mr. Justice Morris, for whom it would be his first high-profile case. Upon commencement of the trial, Mr. Anthony Hawke delivered the opening statement for the prosecution. Mr. Hawkes opened the case by describing what had occurred to Marjorie Gardiner, stating, quote, "So far as it can be ascertained, and this is always a matter difficult to ascertain, she had died some time after midnight on the night of June the 20th, the night before the afternoon on which her body was found." Inquiries brought to light the fact that the last person seen in her company was the accused man. They had been together that Thursday night at the Panama Club in South Kensington from about 11 p.m, and there they were until about midnight or soon after, when they were seen by the receptionist leaving the club premises. They were driven to Pembridge Gardens and stopped near the Pembridge Court Hotel. There they got out and Heath paid the fare. He took a rather a long time over this. He asked first of all what the fare was, and he was told 1 shilling 9 dimes. He then counted out and apparently took some time doing so. During this performance the driver, Mr. Harter, had plenty of opportunity of observing him, and he had since identified Heath as the person who hailed his cab and whom he drove with the woman to Pembridge Gardens and who paid his fare. They were last seen walking together into the gateway which leads to the hotel. Heath booked room number 4 at the hotel on Sunday, June 16th, and in this room the body was found. A formidable case has already been built up against this man. It is a question for you, the jury, whether subsequent events do not make that case even more formidable. The prosecutor continued by advising the jury about what occurred after the murder, stating, Heath arrived at Bournemouth on Sunday, June the 23rd, but 2 days earlier had been in Worthing, where a young woman, Miss Yvonne Simmons, lived with her parents. One would gladly spare that lady the ordeal of having to come into the witness box, but she is a vital witness. Miss Simmons had met him at a dance in London some days before, and had been persuaded by him, under the promise that he would marry her in due course, to spend a night with him in the Pembridge Court Hotel on Sunday, June 16th. That might have been the reason for Heath having booked a room at the hotel on that Sunday. After their night together, Miss Simmons returned to Worthing. On Friday, June the 21st, he rang her up and said he was in Worthing and would like to have lunch with her. He booked a room at the Ocean Hotel in Worthing, and they met again. That evening he took her to a club, where they had dinner and danced. Heath told Miss Simmons that the woman in the Pembridge Court Hotel had been murdered. He said that he himself had not been sleeping in the room at the time because he had given the key to a man who had nowhere else to sleep in London. He also said that he, Heath, had been taken by Inspector Barrett, meaning Superintendent Barrett of the Metropolitan Police, in a car to the hotel to prove that he was not there when the murder was committed. Heath told Miss Simmons that in Barrett's view the girl had been suffocated, but he thought that it was a poker that had killed her, and added to Miss Simmons, it might have been the act of a sexual maniac. Mr. Hawkes advised the jury they might find themselves disposed to agree with this astonishing conversation, but apart from the statement that the woman had been murdered at the hotel room, there was not a word of truth in what he said to Miss Simmons. The curious thing is, he continued, that his conversation contained observations which were uncannily near the truth. It would appear that Heath was telling her a fact connected with the murder, which it is hard to see that he could possibly have known unless he had been there at the time. Mr. Barrett did not tell Heath that he thought the girl had been suffocated. Heath had no communication with Superintendent Barrett on that subject. Certainly Mr. Barrett has expressed no such opinion, nor, so far as any inquiry can elicit, had any announcement to that effect appeared in any newspaper or any announcement that would have brought this detail to Heath's attention. Yet she did die of suffocation. You, the jury, may ask yourselves how he knew. Where did the idea come from? There may be an obvious answer to these two questions. Mr. Hawkes proceeded to ask the jury, quote, would it be the act of a reasonable man to give his room to a stranger, as he had suggested in his letter to Superintendent Barrett? If it was so, this man must have apparently opened Heath's luggage and found in it the instrument with which the injuries were inflicted, found the materials for the crime all ready to hand, and possessed himself of Heath's switch and handkerchief. Maybe you are going to be asked to say that at the time Heath did it, that he was suffering from a disease of the mind, and could not be held responsible. It is very common when somebody does something which is out of the ambit of ordinary social responsibilities to say things like, no one in his sense would have done anything like that, and he must have been mad. The fact a man acts abnormally is not to excuse him from the responsibilities of what he has done. The prosecution do not invite you to think that the person who inflicted these horrible injuries and mutilated this poor girl was a person in his normal frame of mind. You may think there is evidence that this person was sexually perverted, as to be almost a monstrosity. I suggest an impulse which results in grievous bodily harm or the death of the victim is not to be excused on the grounds of insanity. You, the jury, will hear also that he arrived in Bournemouth, not calling himself by his name, but in the name of Rupert Brooks. It is a matter for you, but you may think that if you don't know that what you have done is wrong through a defective reason, or in a state of mind when you think what you have done is right, you don't subsequently endeavour to cover your tracks and to shift the responsibility elsewhere. You, the jury, may think, when the facts of this case are before you, that they are proof that this is a plain case of murder done in circumstances of cruelty and brutality. An act or acts committed may be during the satisfaction of a perverted instinct, but not in such circumstances, you may think, as to excuse the perpetrator of it from responsibility." End quote. The defence, led by Mr. Casewell, presented their argument, instructing the jury that the case was one of partial insanity. He went on, stating, quote, "I will not cross-examine any witnesses about matters fact. You may have come to the conclusion that that man was the man who did these terrible and inhuman acts. It would have been useless to put further questions to the prosecution. Although they might have been satisfied that Heath's was the hand that did this act, his mind was not behind the hand. Therefore he could not be guilty, because he was not responsible for his actions. You, the jury, must decide whether Heath was sane. Not now, not when he wrote the letter to Superintendent Barrett, not when he gave his statements to the police, but at the time when the terrible acts were committed. Heath, in a state of progressive mania, had killed and terribly mutilated 2 women. It is something which can only be called sadism, the sort of man you have to deal with committed 2 terrible and apparently motiveless crimes within a fortnight. The second crime, in which the injuries were far more terrible, was committed when he must have known that the police were hunting him throughout Britain, yet he makes no effort at any disguise except a change of name. He took the girl from the hotel, spoke to the hotel porter when they left, and did everything to show that he was the man who was associated with the girl. It is almost unimaginable. If you have read this in fiction, you would have thrown the book aside and said, "It is impossible, it didn't happen." You would say that a man doesn't commit a crime like this, a second one, when he knows the police are hunting him, and when his name is in the papers day after day. It is not a thing which a sane, reasonable man does. The only explanation is that this man was in such a state of mind that he obtained from some satisfaction from maltreating human beings. I am not going to call Neville Heath to testify. You would probably not believe a word he says. No one except a psychiatrist or a psychologist can estimate a man's mental quality by hearing him give evidence. Mr. Casewell went on to explain that Heath was only standing trial for the murder of Marjorie Gardiner, despite him being charged with 2 murders, stating that those of us acting on his behalf have come to the conclusion that it is only right that the jury should know all the facts of both this case and of the subsequent case. Having heard the opening statements, witnesses were called to testify. Yvonne Simmons' appearance was highly anticipated, and as she stepped into the box she was clearly nervous, and at times she became so distressed that at one point she almost fainted. Her testimony revolved around her brief relationship with Heath, to whom she considered herself to be engaged. She stated that he had behaved like the perfect gentleman, who treated her courteously. Prosecutor Mr. Hawke pointed at Heath and asked Yvonne whether he was the man she was engaged to. She briefly glanced at the accused, who never raised his eyes throughout her testimony, and confirmed him to be her fiancé. She proceeded to describe how he had told her about Marjorie Gardiner's murder, with him telling her it was, quote, "a very gruesome sight," with him asserting that only a sexual maniac could carry out such a deed. When asked about how the conversation came about, she advised he had told her he knew something about the case that had been in the papers, but she had no reason to believe that he was responsible for the crime. When Alice Wyatt, the hotel manager at the Pembridge Court Hotel, took to the stand, she identified Heath as the man who had rented room number 4, before explaining how the body of Marjorie Gardiner was found. During cross-examination, Mr. Casewell, for the defence, highlighted there were some issues that could have pointed to someone else perpetrating the murder. He got Alice to confirm that no one had seen Heath and Marjorie in the hotel that night, nor did anyone see Heath leave. Alice also confirmed that there had never been a poker in the room. She had never seen Heath in uniform or carrying a switch or a stick. The next witness was Miss Iris Humphrey, a friend of Mrs. Gardiner. With the defence attempting to present the idea that Marjorie was promiscuous, planting the idea that she had gone to the room with another man, as Heath had claimed. This argument, that no one saw Heath enter the hotel with Marjorie, was contradicted by Harold Harter, the taxi driver who had collected the couple from the Panama Club, and he had dropped them off within 50 yards of the hotel. He recalled that Heath had his arm around the woman's waist as they walked away. He was also able to identify Heath in a lineup, which only strengthened the case against the defendant. With regards to Heath's claim to Yvonne that he had been made aware of the death by a phone call from Superintendent Thomas Barrett, the officer took to the stand, and he denied such a conversation took place, and stated that he had never taken Heath to see the body. The prosecution's case was bolstered by the testimony of the renowned pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson. In conjunction with evidence presented to the court, he was able to describe how Marjorie's ankles had been bound by a handkerchief. Injuries on the body were consistent with the victim being punched, and 17 wounds had been caused by a whip. All of these injuries had been caused prior to death, which was ultimately due to her being smothered with a pillow. He placed the time of death at some time in the early hours of June the 21st. During cross-examination, Dr. Simpson stated that Marjorie had been gagged, but this had not been the cause of death. He also advised that he had found no evidence to suggest sexual intercourse had occurred. The next witness, Dr. Herbert, who at the time was considered the country's leading psychiatrist, was called on the behalf of the defence. He admitted that the savagery of the murders indicated that a sadist had committed the crime. Mr. Casewell opened the questioning by asking about Heath's previous criminal acts. Quote, "Was there an occasion in March this year that Heath had made an attack on a woman at a hotel, but not nearly so severe as in either of these cases, as in which no prosecution was followed?" The doctor confirmed this was the case, and proceeded to state that after interviews with Heath, his parents and acquaintances, he believed Heath to be certifiable as morally insane. In law, he is morally defective. When asked how he would describe the violence shown during the murder, Dr. Herbert confirmed the attacks were extremely savage, of a nature which could only be done by a sadist, and not by ordinary violence. Returning to the defendant's criminal record, Mr. Casewell asked, "When one finds this history of general delinquency combined with sexual or sadistic activity, what presumption does it raise in your mind?" The doctor replied that the man is born with deficient moral sense and will commit any type of crime of wide range, not confined to one field. He continued, "Heath appeared to show no remorse, no appreciation of what other people would think of his behaviour. I think his general behaviour after committing these crimes follows the same lines as his attitude that other people would not think very harshly what he had done, and therefore he behaved in quite a casual manner, considering his intelligence." He added that the breakdown of Heath's marriage and separation from his child may have contributed towards a pre-existing mental condition, causing it to worsen. Following this testimony, the prosecution called the senior medical officer at Brixton Prison, Dr. Hugh Grierson, who had been observing Neville Heath since his detention on the 8th of July. The doctor also confirmed that he had reviewed the defendant's medical and criminal records. He told the court that he believed Heath to be a sadist, adding, quote, "Sadism, although it is called perversion, I would rather call an abnormal exaggeration of a normal instinct, or of the instinctive reactions in the animal kingdom, including the human race." When asked whether he thought Heath was insane, Dr. Grierson replied There was no evidence that Heath was suffering from any mental disease at the time of the occurrences. After this line of questioning, the court was adjourned till the following morning, when Mr. Casewell recalled Dr. Grierson to answer questions under cross-examination. However, prior to this commencing, the jury inquired whether they could ask the doctor a question, which they were instructed to put in writing. The jury wished to know whether there was anything that could have affected Heath's brain, causing him to commit his crimes. Dr. Grierson stated that there was no abnormality or injury to the defendant's brain. Under cross-examination, Mr. Casewell for the defence asked Dr. Grierson about a confidential document that seemed to have been misplaced, which had caused Heath to lose trust in the doctor. Dr. Grierson admitted that the defendant had become more withdrawn since the document was lost, but that Heath had already refused to speak about the murder charge prior to this, and at no point had he mentioned experiencing blackouts, adding that, quote, "he is not willing to say much except to say that his sexual instincts and impulses were normal." Mr. Casewell then questioned the doctor regarding his opinion of Neville Heath's character, to which Dr. Grierson agreed that the defendant had a psychopathic personality. When pushed on his opinion regarding Dr. Hubert's testimony from the day prior, Dr. Grierson stated that he disagreed with the assessment, that Heath didn't know what he was doing was wrong when he committed the murder. The questioning then turned to the claim that Heath was a sadist, with Mr. Casewell asking, "The sadist, in your view, is it or is it not usual for a sadist to be a delinquent in other ways?" To which the witness replied, "I have known occasions where sadists have not committed other crimes, but I have known cases where sadists have committed other crimes." The defence pushed for more information. Quote, "It would be important to find out, when forming your diagnosis of the mind, whether, in addition to being a sadist, he also had shown delinquency of another character, such as swindling and lying and fraud." "Yes," replied Dr. Grierson, before stating, "this man is 29, and to be a moral defective his condition would have had to be obvious before the age of 18 years. Mr. Casewell then referred to Dr. Herbert's findings, arguing that he had stated that, having found these delinquencies happening after Heath had left school, he is led to believe that there was mental defectiveness before this. Confidently, Dr. Grierson responded, "I cannot agree with that. There is no history, so far as I can tell, of any abnormality before the age of 18. Since then, all his offences have been to his own advantage, and he has apparently taken precautions to prevent detection." The questioning concluded with Dr. Grierson's assessment that, quote, "Heath is a psychopath, someone who takes a short-term view, a person who does what he feels like doing at that moment, without any thought of the consequences. That was not a disease of the mind, it was a matter of abnormal character." His testimony was strengthened when the prosecution called upon Dr. Young, who had been a prison doctor for 26 years. However, he admitted he was not a practicing mental health expert. He told the court, quote, "I do not think Heath is insane. I think he is a psychopathic personality and is a sadist. He has certain abnormal impulses. He has a perversion of the sexual instinct which is manifest in sadism." He proceeded to agree with the prosecution's statement that Heath was able to hold a rational conversation, demonstrating no signs of a disease of the mind, and that he knew the difference between right and wrong. Having seen all the evidence and heard the arguments from the opposing counsels, the jury were dismissed for deliberation. Almost an hour later they returned with a guilty verdict, upon which the judge donned his black cap and sentenced Neville Heath to death for the murder of Marjorie Gardiner. In the days after the guilty verdict, news reports proclaimed it as, quote, "the most sensational of the century," and feeding the public's macabre desire for details on the case, newspapers began printing various stories, with the Sunday Pictorial publishing their exclusive of Heath's story in his own words, to be issued over 3 weeks. The Lancashire Evening Post ran an article in which they interviewed a woman called Peggy. I do not believe that this is the same one the police were searching for during Doreen Marshall's investigation. Peggy told the reporter she had met Heath in Bournemouth, describing how he was introduced to her as Bob Brooks, and continued to recall how they spent time together, stating, quote, "We went to a tea dance and afterwards sat on the sands. Bob appeared to be in need of somebody to talk to. He gave the impression that he had something on his mind. He always seemed to have a distant look in his eyes. They were light blue, and occasionally the most troubled expression came over his face. He drank very heavily most of the time. After dinner that same night, 4 of us went for a walk along the sea, where he said good evening to a number of people. Peggy also explained that Bob, as she knew him, asked for her hand in marriage, stating, suddenly as we were walking along, he said he was in great need of being looked after, and asked me to marry him. All along the promenade he kept taking hold of my arm and kept pushing his attention on me, pleading for sympathy and attention. I would not have tolerated it had I not felt that he was labouring under some unhappiness, for he kept asking me to marry him all the way back to the hotel. He also told me he had an income of £2,500 a year as a test pilot. In the hotel that evening he was in a heavy, morbid frame of mind. He asked me if I would not accept marriage, whether I would agree to other suggestions. I told him not to be ridiculous, but that I was prepared to give him my friendship and sympathy if he was ready to behave himself. When he was sober, elderly ladies in the hotel thought he was charming. He had stopped drinking after I told him I would not talk to him if he persisted to do so. Later the police telephoned me and told me that they had found my name and address in one of Heath's pocketbooks. They came round to see me, and the officer told me I was the luckiest person to be alive. While stories like this filled the pages of the newspapers, there were also serious questions asked regarding the handling of the case by Scotland Yard, with many criticising them for not releasing a picture of Neville Heath when he was named a person of interest. The argument being that if Doreen Marshall had seen the photograph, it could have saved her life. Scotland Yard's stance on the matter was that such a release may have affected the case against Heath, with key testimony resting on eyewitness accounts, which could be disputed if there was a chance they had seen Heath's image prior to confirming him as the man they saw on the night of the murder. By the beginning of October it was announced that Neville Heath would not be appealing his sentence, and after the prisoner had undergone a psychological exam performed by 2 doctors, the Home Secretary upheld the sentence. This development did not seem to faze Heath, who apparently maintained a cheerful disposition. It did, however, cause heartbreak for his loving parents, whom he still refused to see. Heath was resigned to his fate, even stating so in a letter written during his trial, in which he wrote, "I don't care what happens to me. I've nothing to live for since I lost my wife and child." Mrs. van der Elst, who was a staunch supporter of the abolition of the death penalty, came forward stating she had, quote, "fresh evidence concerning the early life of Neville Heath. With these new facts, I am hoping to obtain a reprieve." Her attempts to meet the Home Secretary regarding this new information failed, with Mrs. van der Elst being advised by one of his private secretaries that they would pass the information on to him. Any hope the campaigner had for a last-minute reprieve were dashed when on Wednesday the 16th of October 1946 at 9 a.m. Neville Heath's sentence was carried out. Shortly afterwards, a notice was placed outside the prison declaring that the execution had been conducted. The case garnered a large public following, as was evident by the crowd who had gathered outside Pentonville Prison on the day of the execution. It also highlighted the growing demand for the abolition of the death penalty. Posters had been pasted on the walls of the prison opposing the punishment, and when Mrs. van der Elst arrived at the prison, blocking the road with her yellow Rolls-Royce, she proceeded to hand out leaflets declaring, quote, "The fresh evidence. Heath is not responsible for his actions. I myself discovered last night when visiting his mother that when he was born his brain was terribly injured. In fact, they thought he would die. His mother also nearly died. This man was a possessed madman and should have been sent to Broadmoor." The protest stirred up the crowd, with some supporting van der Elst, while others became angered by her stance, resulting in the police intervening. For her actions, the campaigner was charged with obstructing a highway and was fined £2, roughly £30 today. Despite the charge against her, she proudly stated, "Everyone knows I am against capital punishment, and I'd give my life to stop this law." Thank you for listening to this episode of It's Murder Up North. The next episode is coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.